We've been here, this is our third day here. And for the first 2 days, Daniel was kind enough to hook us up with 4 different workshops that were like 2 hours each. And
thanks, Daniel.
The initial hope of this session was going to be, we were going to do all these hands-on activities with participants, and then this was going to be show and tell time of the participants. One thing I'm noticing is very few people who came to the workshops are here now. Yes, we have one, 2. Okay, yeah, people who are paid to be there were there. Yeah, okay. So we do have those. So you can take that as you like. But what we could do at some point, it's not going to be my first suggestion, will be we could give you just the briefest overview of the materials we did share with the workshop participants, because some of it are actual tools that we have kind of left with the DMLL. And I do know that a number of the participants intend to follow up. So although they're not ready to really show the work they did with it just yet, there is some stuff here. There are some new toys for you to play with here. So we could do a very brief just overview of what some of those new things are. But we thought before that, I should say, the reason why there's very little show was, and you'll be shocked to learn this, these were 2-hour workshops, and we just talked through the whole time. And people didn't really have time to do things. And there's a theme here, because we each gave a talk today, and I think we were told fairly clearly, 30 minutes, 15 minutes for discussion. Sounds good. We agreed to that.
Yeah.
And of course, both of us went long, even on 45 minutes. So we thought just before we, because you may have guessed, we can talk all night, folks. But before we do that, we thought if any of you have questions or comments, pushback, complaints, we actually enjoy critical comments. It's certainly not considered rude by us. Although do keep in mind, I am highly sensitive and I am under the doctor's care. And I'm already in hoc to him, so anything too personally hurtful to me could financially ruin me. But I am thankfully under your care.
I'm close.
Yeah. So does anyone have comments or questions about either of our sessions? Yeah.
Yeah, really enjoyed the last session. I'm going to mix 2 parts of it together, which for me I felt were extremely important. And I think a lot of people are missing this personally. But first of all, was you were collecting together and you were saying, let's build a room, let's whack in the Atari, let's whack in the VCR, let's put the sofa, which was making a very real physical extension of space that we could step into and experience and all that kind of stuff. I thought that was absolutely brilliant, but actually not typically practical in a university if you've got 500 students to actually start to give them those spaces. My background is in virtual and augmented reality spaces, and so one of the things I've been banging on about for the last 10 years, mainly into a brick wall frankly, is the fact that as soon as we start to make these data spaces that you're talking about, the WordPresses, the websites, the HTMLs, the RSS feeds and all those things, as soon as they start to become part of our physical reality, that they are not abstracted, they are an extension of us, they come through our glasses, they come through our haptics, or whatever, all this stuff, and it's not that far away, is I think the issues that you were talking about there will suddenly go from a smile novelty into something actually which we are really going to have to deal with as people, as humans, and I think it could have been one of the most disruptive things and one of the most important things that we might have to deal with in our lifetimes. So there's a comment.
Is that all?
The Eton mess, which we've just had there, is rather nice. So there we go. But if anybody wants to see any of this stuff, then just come and ask. But you connect that with what you were saying, and I think we can actually start to see how important, frankly, this stuff is, both pedagogically as a teacher, because it means I can start to enable my students to experience and work in ways that they would never dream possible, materials that they wouldn't be able to do normally, building whatever and sharing and all that sort of stuff. But I think also from a media and being point of view, and that's my artist coming out, I think it's equally important.
It's interesting. One of the things that, I mean, you're referring, I mean, nothing specifically, but one of the things that comes out is the video of the guy calling for the pizza, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I like about that video is shown to me by Phil Winley, who was at BYU. He was talking about it. And he went back in the archives and I stole it from him. But the idea that once she says we're hooked into the system, right?
Yeah.
The system it actually works both ways.
Oh, yes.
Like the system is you have all that data aggregated in one place. Like all this analytics we're worried, like we're concerned about or excited about.
Yeah.
This is an idea of what it might look like.
Yes.
You know, for the horrific, as Brian mentioned earlier on today, or as for us, in some ways, the empowering, like being able to manage and control and integrate parts of your life in thoughtful ways. So what I also like about the space we're in and why I continually remain compelled by EdTech is that I do think a lot of this stuff is undetermined and ambiguous.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ways to examine and explore it. And I still think we're in the business of making it and creating it. I think some people think maybe the war is lost. I don't know, maybe I'm Pollyanna, but I think there's still space to resist and to create cool things and reclaim some of the power of universities in that conversation. I want to believe.
Absolutely. And in fact, I don't know, is Natalie in here? No. I had a conversation with an intern of mine, and what was really interesting is that one of the issues that we're having to deal with these days is terrorism. And I think you start to look into these spaces as ways that, you know, people are able to manipulate and use terrorism, etc., etc., etc. And it was fascinating talking to I'm going to say a young person because I'm definitely over the other side of this hill, and I look into, I'm not part of. And the view was that how these data spaces were actually able to turn terrorism on their heads, because quite frankly, we're all saying, you know, media can splash stuff around about how this dreadful this is happening, how that dreadful that is happening. But what happened apparently with the Charlie Hebdo thing was that at the same time there was a lot of people whacked up some sort of social media site which was called I'm OK. And so suddenly what appeared to be a very, very strong, horrible, BBC were loving it, look, whole of Paris is exploding, blah, 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 suddenly actually just turned into what it was, a dreadful thing, but actually localised, sensible, and certainly not something that should change entire world politics. So I think that if we take those approach to social media as well, we can be equally empowered. Shall I stop now?
Keep going. You're on a roll.
I think what I said before sounded the opposite of what I meant. I meant like kept going.
Have a mic back.
I'll just a little. I chatted a little with Ian over lunch, and he showed me not only we talked a little bit about the work in 3D immersive worlds, but he does some really cool stuff just with very simple camera screen interfaces and multiple sites. It's actually very Grant Potter-esque, I thought.
Cool.
And so if people have an interest in kind of how digital media and physical immersive space intersect, you should talk to that guy.
Come and talk.
It's funny too, one of the things that happened in the living room, which I love the living room, I've never talked about the living room, but the idea is we had an internet outage for 8 hours on our campus over the 9 months we had it. And it's funny how that space didn't shut down. Every other space in the university had shut down. Like really, they couldn't work. And we were all in there playing Donkey Kong, all right? Like, and it was awesome. And like, it was this sense of, I mean, we can never fully imagine a moment before the internet, even if we lived it, right? Because that's so much of what determines who we are. But for a second, there was a peak about a notion of network that was not completely dependent upon how we build it. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of moment to think about the physicality of networks and how it affects the way you live in space and time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi.
Just a comment. Just a comment and then a question. I was involved, in fact, from the start when a VLE was developed at the university, and I have to say, I'm really glad you guys are around because I feel less guilty now. Because the problem was that a lot of things you say were things that I have to say we warned about, but people always said the same argument that Brian raised this morning. Well, yes, but then these are all the plus factors, but let's ignore the minus factors, we'll sort them out. Yeah. And you're saying we've got to sort them out. The question I want to raise really, because you raised that, Jim, in your last one about, for instance, you gave that example of a academic site really, which then could be linked to. some of the work that I've done after that was looking at virtual research environments, which are the equivalent, obviously, of research. Now, obviously, a lot of the lessons you talk about for VLEs also pass across to those. Wonder whether you want to say a bit more about it, because it seems to me that, again, and for instance, this university is with many, it's got its own little research bit, which unfortunately has got the same maybe confinements as the learning ones have, even more so in some ways. So maybe you could say a bit about how you see that panning across to research?
I do, and I think we both can talk to this to some degree because we've had experience as technologists. A quick thing that I shared during the workshop that we did is an example that I find very compelling is we had a librarian who was a scholar of the Chicago Cubs. His name was Jack Bales. A really compelling researcher, did none of his work online. He built the site as part of the Domain of One's Own initiative and cohort, and he started to publish his research from the late 19th century about Cubs history. And what happened to him is he started to get, links, he started to get calls, he started to get invites, he started to get publications, he's got invited to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Like, he actually built a career. He already had a good career, but he built out a whole relation to his network of scholars that were online that changed the whole way he imagined what it is he did and the value of it. And there could be a lot of pushback on this, but that's something A, the VLE will never make possible. But B, the idea that we're in a space and we're in a moment where the network relations of how we share our work are still simple HTML on a URL that can be shared out. Like, when we went into the VLE, we forgot the basic premise of the web, links and connections. And so I don't think like anything we're talking about is radical. In fact, it's basic, if not remedial. We haven't even gotten on to radical or thoughtful or intelligent. We're just returning higher ed to a basic remedial level of how the web works. But that's powerful, right? Is that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. Actually, I really, I have my moments ago. Why am I up front talking? Every time I talk to any of you individually and about your individual projects, it seems always mind-blowing to what I'm doing. But since I do have a microphone, in Canada we do. I don't know if you use this term in the UK. It's getting to be increasingly important to research projects in Canada when you provide a grant or if you want sustaining funding. There's this idea, they call it knowledge mobilization. And the idea of that is you're supposed to build into your research project an idea how you'll first of all be accessible to public and people beyond the academy or beyond your research groups or whatever your ongoing work is, keeping them up to date on it. And then also whatever your findings are, presenting them in a way that's not only accessible but engaging, attractive, and accessible not just in the sense of being you can get to it, but that people without precise specialist knowledge can get to it. And I don't think we've done a great job, at least in Canada, maybe you do it better here, of providing that kind of support work. So what the nice thing about the kind of work that we do when we're trying to provision good personal learning spaces, I find that stuff extends pretty naturally for people wanting to present their research. And again, it's not that complicated. It's really just about providing, reasonably customizable, reasonably manageable environments that people can, shape to the way they need them to go. One of the more successful ones we did at my university in Canada, we have an incredibly shameful history with Indigenous people, and even within living memory, we were taking Native kids away from their families, putting them in residential schools where they were subjected to every kind of horrific abuse you can imagine. And many of these people are still alive. So there's been this Truth and Reconciliation Commission happening. So, there's some project works happening at my university because we have a very large Indigenous population nearby. And this is exactly the kind of work when you're doing the ongoing work. And the particular project that was at my university was actually an art project. Have that kind of easy access point where people in the communities could contribute to the project just by email, but then at the same time still be incorporated into the site itself. And then also at the same time, we had the syndication capacity where we started to see similar projects popping up across Canada, partly because we were in the open and easy to find and people would contact us. We were able to extend that capacity up to them just as easily as just provisioning another site and creating syndicated networks. And this was all the technology that existed in 2003. I mean, this is trailing edge stuff. So I guess I don't know, I hope that's not too long-winded way of addressing your thing, but I think these tools do extend the capacity for the research space, particularly the idea of just demonstrating our relevance to the public beyond our specializations. I saw that you had your hand up.
No, it was sort of curiosity. One, our local takeaway place actually got. Sorry, I'm not repeating stuff. Hi.
Hello?
I'm Dina. Our local takeaway place kind of works like that now. You ring up, they know who we are, we know what our last order was, they know how we pay, and they know how we want it. That comes. Two is you won't know this, but we had a hurricane in 1987 in England, in the south of England. And apart from being an artist, I was a nurse at that time, and I was in a hospital on top of the hill. Everything disappeared, including all electricity, all connection with the outside world. And you had some kind of realistic notion of what it might be if there was a nuclear disaster. There was no TV, there was no radio, there was no nothing. There were policemen running around in the south of England. And you look at this stuff and you just say, what happens when it goes away? We're still people.
Yeah. I mean,
Oh, and thirdly, thank you for taking me through the history of my husband's development, because I've seen every console that I think we've had over the last X number of years.
That's blown my coat.
yeah, I can see there's going to be a console living room going up in a basement near you, right? That was my thing when I moved to Italy. I was like, can I get this console stuff here in Italy and build a room? They don't have the same eBay culture we have in the U.S. They're not as nostalgic as we are, because they have 900-year-old walls. Like
the
you.
80s doesn't quite stack up to the Roman Empire, I guess, in their view.
Exactly.
I don't know why.
But to your point, I mean, I think when you bring it back to the notion of what's left with is people, right? And there's been this kind of insidious idea that content is infrastructure. And I think one of the things that I'm far more interested in is people as infrastructure. And that's particularly relevant in higher ed in the US when we're outsourcing so much of our teaching to temporary labor, and not to mention, as Brian did this morning, the idea of algorithms to do our grading for us. Like, there's really big questions about, the idea of humans and infrastructure in relationship to the workplace that need to be thought about. So, yeah, I mean, I hope this stuff doesn't go away. Tom Woodward, who's a friend of mine who does this, he's he's half survivalist. Like, he's not really, but he wants to be. Like, he does these models. Like, 72 hours without electricity. Like, do we start to devolve into a chaotic, cannibalistic society? I mean, he gives it about 72 to 84 hours without electricity, where we're all starting to
Eat each other.
So that's a cheerful notion, I guess. But
We had a boil of water advisory in Vancouver, and within 24 hours, people were having fistfights over bottled water in the supermarket. So.
more seriously, look at Flint, Michigan, and what happened there in terms of basic infrastructure and support for people versus, corporatism and failed government. That moment you make and that point you make when you start thinking about post-Katrina or even Flint, or look at what's happening in Detroit, in the richest country in the world, and you see you're not far off at all. In fact, some people live it.
What about the other side of it, actually? There was big power
Can't hear you, Alan.
outages in New York.
We're going to get you.
There was the big power outages in New York, and the one in the sort of 80s, and everybody
Yeah.
went mad and robbed everything and killed people. And
That's
then you
one
had
of my
another
favorite
one,
movies.
A little bit.
No,
And then but that's just New York. They're just killing each other all the time.
Yeah, that's right. In the 70s, that was basically like,
And then
I
there
think
was-
during the blackout, they took a break.
Well, there was the one sort of in the 90s then where it turned into more of a party and there was less violence and everything. So it isn't necessarily that when the power's turned off we all start killing and eating each other. What do you think was the difference between the first time and last time? What had changed in culture to make us love each other on that occasion instead of want to kill each other?
Gentrification. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Gentrification was what changed. If you look at New York in the 70s and you look at that, there was a movie called Blackout. You should watch it. 1979, really bad B movie. It's about the 78 blackout in New York. And it was violent. I was in New York at the time. Battle down. Even think about LA in 92. with the Rodney King riots. I mean, that wasn't, kumbaya at all. And I was there too. But then think about, more pressingly, New York in the early 2000s is when that happened, was becoming, like London, a completely gentrified city, a completely wealthy city, right? And all of the poor in New York, you have to go search them out now. Whereas in the 70s, they were everywhere. And that was Giuliani's legacy, right? He was the mayor of New York at the time, probably remember that because of 9/11, was driving out droves of people to actually live around JFK in like kind of slum camps. Yeah, exactly. I don't know why. I'm sorry.
You're
Brian?
doubling up on the microphone. You already have a microphone. We are wandering afield now into urban crime theory.
What's in the box?
Go ahead. I'll get into the box after Alex.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Don't give him my microphone.
I was just thinking, because obviously you've done this over in Mary Washington and you still have a VLE, so what does that look like after, like, post-gym?
Speaking of post-disaster scenario planning.
Because obviously we're imagining, what if our universities try some of these models and we separate them out and everyone has their own domain,
Yeah.
and everyone's thinking, what happens with the VLE and everything, but obviously that's happened there, so has it changed? I imagine it hasn't changed a massive amount.
Well, it wasn't, so that's always the problem is, because I'm so good looking and naturally magnetic, people associate everything with gym. And that's just a natural thing that happens to me. I go into the room, people say, okay. But the more reality is this was a community effort. There were over 80 faculty who had their own domain in web hosting. People like Martha Burtis, who are still at UMW, was a huge advocate. They hired and brought in a crew that thinks and imagines this way because it's part of their strategic plan. So it's like one person is not infrastructure either. A community of people work together is infrastructure.
Yeah.
So that would depend.
I mean, I only obviously know you, so I don't know those guys. So I just meant the movement that was happening there. But whether does Moodle or whatever you use there still exist in the same form? Is it still as...
Yeah, absolutely. The
aggressive?
LMS is still happening. It's still going. But what I think we did, and this was to the point earlier, is show that there's a lot of options beyond the VLE. And that faculty, once they see the power of the open web and what that does to their work, they don't go back, right? I mean, you have tools now that are easier to use than Moodle, are easier to use than Canvas, called WordPress, right? Like, these are not more complicated tools in many ways. They're more elegant, they're simpler. So I don't think it creates like, oh, I didn't have Jim Groom to tell me to use WordPress now, I'm gonna stop using it, right? Like, I was forgotten 2 weeks after I left. Right? And that's the reality also institutionally, right? Like, you're not as important as you ever think you are.
I think we've had that here where we say, well, try this, try that. There's other tools out there, and they say, well, I've already learned. I know Moodle, and we're trying to explain it. It's not one or the other.
Yeah.
You can do both, and at least you can try and, I guess, regain a bit of that control, which is
I agree.
Back to the title.
And I think one of the things they did well at UMW, and we did well, is we tied it into curriculum. It wasn't just, hey, go do this. Because when we tried to give it to first-year students, they were like, I'm just trying to figure out what this whole thing university is. I don't care about my domain. Whereas juniors and seniors who have been part of a department who's interested in this were locked in. And they saw it as a great alternative to LinkedIn. So, or even as a, not alternative to, as a building upon. Maybe that's not a necessary binary.
It would be great if you could, because I don't know if many people in the room are fully aware of the things that you can do with the idea of the domain of your own, of one's own, and also the...
We got one more question.
Oh, pardon me. Hi.
Sorry, it's really a silly one. It's about the power that when we think about technologies, we think that they can change society. Basically, politicians provide laptops to children, thinking it will change their lives, especially for poverty. So the idea is that providing laptops and web and mobile phones, they can break this difficult chain. So just wondering your point of view on the way technologies can really change society.
I thought you were going to make a silly point. And then I was relaxed for a moment. I have a microphone.
Oh, okay.
I can
He's very
project.
hostile. The therapy's not working.
Violation therapy, I would not recommend it. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm dependent on him now, though. Sorry, Pat, what were you gonna say?
Question. Not if you want to say something, just.
Oh, I have something, but go ahead.
No. You're going to need to get therapy again. I won't say that into the mic.
Too late.
Going back to the VLE versus WordPress, LMS versus WordPress, me and Brian had this conversation last week that Blackboard became that unpopular that everyone went looking for something else. Moodle turned up at the right time and became the next thing. Moodle is now blackboarding, for want of a word. What do we do when WordPress blackboards?
I mean, Brian.
I
I
want-
could. Yeah. Okay. I'll take.
You
this
answer
quickly.
that one, and then I'll answer.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think.
And then we will actually do what we've been asked to do.
I don't think that there's too much of a risk in that because WordPress has never been interested in education. They've always been like, when I've been talking to Matt Mullenweg and trying to get our stuff out in front of it, he's like, I hate education. I didn't go to college. I think you guys are cretins. And that's fine because I don't think it's driven by us. We got to make sense of it, what we can do. And the thing about WordPress that worked is it was easy and it was extensible and it's open source. At the point they start closing their source, which doesn't seem like it can happen, or we find another tool, maybe that will be an issue. But for me, the thing that we learned about WordPress is it's protean. It can be whatever you want it to be based on the plugins, the themes, and your ability. And it's not the only tool out there, but for just people who aren't maybe as tech savvy as many or programmers, it's enough. So it's just enough technology. Brian.
And then we got Ian to make a comment.
Yeah,
These are how things spiral out of control. I'm not going to throw
throw
that.
it.
Really? I'm not. If it was my university, I would have thrown it.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to go super political on this, in fact, exactly the opposite. It's really just a statement, and I think, Lewis, you need your question answered, but what is the responsibility of the university in this context? Because we take something like WordPress, and I agree with you completely, fab piece of software, open source, extensible. If I have enough savvy about me, I can whack it up on a website, you know, I'm not reliant on anybody, blah, blah, blah. Hands up in this room, people who would feel comfortable doing that. Okay, lots. All right, that takes that argument.
Holy cow.
But my point is that do we as an institution have a responsibility for supporting that? And I'm thinking in terms of as technology moves on and my mum loses her digital photographs all over the place and things like that. Is there a responsibility for us to maintain those? And I'm sort of thinking, and I'll probably get the name wrong, there's a site called Wayback When Machine.
Wayback Machine.
Yeah, absolutely awesome. And should we be putting things like that in, which enable us to? Have I said the right thing? Shall I just stop? You know what I'm about, don't you?
You're preaching to the choir, and we're just kind of looking at each other because if we could have just repackaged the keynotes we've given in previous years, because we would make arguments like that. And actually, you didn't see my talk, and I actually went on about the university's kind of timeless missions as stewards of knowledge. So, and I would argue that.
And at some point, we'll be in a position where we have our own little data set, if that's built into us in some way, and fine. But I think until we get to that point, there's probably a responsibility somewhere to, otherwise we will just lose swathes of history and everything that we're losing.
But that's also part of the conversation because what part of the data the students want us to keep that they have or not. So there's an interesting negotiation.
If it's syndicated, then
That's right.
That's the key. If it syndicate's fine. Yeah. But if I screw it up because I don't understand and I do something silly, then is there a wider? If I've written it down on pieces of paper at the moment, we've got libraries or we've got ways of storing. And at the moment, I think with technology, we're in this funny place where we don't have that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't presume to have an answer to your question, and it's a very important question. Other than to say, I don't think either Jim or I are really big fans of that kind of school of thought called techno-solutionism. It kind of turns their stomachs, and I know we get lumped in with that, but I think there might have been a time where I was more enthusiastic about the potential of this technology to enact positive social change, but we've been around the blocks a few times, and we've just kind of seen how things have gone. That said, I got excited about digital technology because as I came across it when I was a student. I thought, this is something that allows us to make limitless copies of things, more or less for free. That's a scholarly attribute, isn't it? And it allows me to connect materials or even my immediate presence with anyone else in the world with an internet connection. That's got to be an attribute, at least for scholarly work, if nothing else. and the ability to take an artifact and do things with it that you used to need professional grade equipment and years of training to be able to do, and now we all just do it on our phones. It's sad that with all those new powers, we haven't seen some sort of how could this not be like some revolutionary transformation in consciousness? But I don't know what's happening. I don't know.
I think it
I
is.
wouldn't. Yeah.
I do think we're going through a revolutionary transformation of
Why
consciousness.
does everything seem to be getting worse?
I don't think it is. I'm not techno-solutionist, but I think that we are going through transforming notions of identity in space and time. But, I mean, there's bad things happening, but I think this is affecting our consciousness, and it's transforming us. And like any point in history, it's not going to be all good. There's going to be a lot of bad to it. But I mean, there can be a focus a little bit too much on, everyone's trying to steal and kill. I don't know.
How much time do we have to show the toolbox?
2 minutes.
Very quickly. It's all on a site called innovationtoolbox.net, which we're leaving with you, and the keys will be turned over to the DMLL. You already have a WordPress multi-site at your institution already, by the way. And there is a willingness to extend that out. I've already talked about Splot, so I won't, other than to remind you all that if you want one, get in touch with me, and I'll make one for you. I'm not going to talk about animated GIFs, although that's all I really want to talk about. But one of the things we did leave for you is this really powerful application framework called Sandstorm. Now, in the past, I've always really struggled with my IT department at universities because if I want an application installed, they need to provision a server, they need to provision the network layer, they need to get the database set up, they need to configure it with the firewall. It took me 18 months to get an installation of MediaWiki when I went to Thomson Rivers University. And then I remember I got the email where I said, well, I can't seem to access it off campus. And they went, you want this on the internet? It was a good day. So there's this incredibly powerful framework called Sandstorm, which has a large number of open source applications. And by the way, this has now been installed. We're handing the keys over. This is coventry.sandstorm.io. You can't actually access it right now because we still are working some issues out with your campus firewall. But you can access it from home or on your phone. Essentially, it's a wide variety of apps. Etherpad is a very, very powerful live writing document. I've had 20 people inside a text document live typing, and it syncs up almost instantaneously. So it's kind of like Google Docs, but again, self-hosted on a London-based data center controlled by your institution. So hopefully a little bit more sanctioned. Rocket Chat, if anyone's ever used a kind of tool with some vogue right now called Slack, which is a kind of a fluid, kind of texty, Twittery kind of project management space. Rocket Chat looks and behaves a lot like Slack. It's simpler, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's tools like Davros and FileDrop, which behave very much like Dropbox. Actually, like in Davros, if you put a video file in and you click that link, it actually will generate a video player in most browsers, so it's a quick and dirty video server. Piwik is essentially Google Analytics, but again, on your server, you're not sending your data to Google, but it has all the same capabilities of taking in data. It'll generate pie charts to your heart's content. Music player devices, MediaWiki, and WordPress. The thing that's really cool about it, though, is there's cPanel, which lets you install apps. Now, this is a relatively new installation, so I don't have a lot of these. Every time I install a copy of one of these apps and do something to it, it becomes, they call it Sandstorm, every individual app is a grain. Now, let's say I take Rocket Chat and I set it up with 4 channels, I put in some Twitter bots, I trick out the theme, I get it really nice. Now, normally with a server, you would have to, again, install Rocket Chat, say, hey, what bots did you use? And actually physically add them and kind of set it up. With Sandstorm, I can literally either just share or clone or export that configured thing with content in it and share it instantly. And every single application lives in its own little container, which from a security point of view is really interesting. Because if one of those containers gets hacked, somebody does something stupid and installs a bad plugin in their WordPress site, they don't bring the whole thing down. they just bring down their own container. And it's virtualized, so there's really good backups. In most cases, you just go back to what it looked like yesterday. So it greatly increases our ability to spin up new applications. It allows us to share configured, ready-to-run tools with each other the way we would share a PowerPoint deck or a paper. And because of the configuration of it, it dramatically lowers the risk of failure. In other words, you should have a lot more freedom to do weird stuff and try to make mistakes and try to break things. So we're leaving this with you. Yeah, and I guess that we'll just leave it at that for now.
Awesome. Big fan.
Okay.